The COVID inquiry finally begins. Who would have thought here we are on the Pandemic Podcast, still talking about COVID 3 years after its emergence in 2020? Well, the COVID inquiry in the UK finally begins after the first preliminary hearings last year in October, where the legal team and Baroness Hallett determined the scope and how the inquiry would begin to operate. Well, today marks the first formal day of the inquiry where evidence has begun to be heard. Now, as you will know if you've seen any of my previous content, I come at this with deep skepticism about what will actually be found. But I've taken plenty of notes on today's proceedings. I'm going to walk you through some of those notes. So if you catch me looking off screen, it's because there's a lot to cover and there's only so much I can remember. But the reality is, how can we forget what's happened over the last few years? How can we forget? Now, whatever angle we look at this from, whether we are critical of the narratives and approaches that were undertaken over the last few years in response to COVID, or whether you were in favor of those narratives or supportive of those narratives, this time will surely be etched in our minds. Now, what will this inquiry throw up? What will it actually discover? That's the big question. Well, Heather Hallett, who is the inquiry chair, opened the hearing today by saying that she intends to answer three questions. One, was the UK properly prepared for a pandemic? Two, was the response appropriate? And three, what lessons can we learn for the future? Now, how likely is it, in skeptic corner, we will say, that these questions will be appropriately answered when the COVID inquiry stipulated that virus tests, lateral flow tests for attendees would be potentially required for those giving evidence more than a year after lateral flow tests were scrapped? Now, of course, these were not obligatory, as many of the actual guidance, much of the actual guidance during the course of the lockdown was not actually mandatory, but they made it seem as such. And people were told that they can wear masks in order to feel more comfortable. This is despite the fact that Brian Stanton from the British Medical Association, during the course of the inquiry, told the panel that the limitations of surgical face masks and their inability to adequately reduce transmission has been known as early as 2008. Many would argue far earlier. Now, why is this inquiry important? Well, first of all, those three questions are important. They are important. They are important to understand what worked, what went wrong. And if you've been a follower of this show for any amount of time, you know we've done over 500 episodes asking this question, asking many of the questions that most seem unwilling to ask, and looking at this whole debacle from a whole manner of angles. Now, I will touch upon, obviously, the sensitive subject matter here, in that people genuinely did lose loved ones during this period of time. And for those people, they will never forget it for different reasons. And my sympathies are with those and those who have lost lives as a result of policies. But we must put those emotions aside, as difficult as that must be for the course of this inquiry, and even our own emotions about the policies and the implications of those policies. And we must come to look at these with rational objectivity in order to actually answer those important questions. It's very difficult for human beings to discount our emotional connection to these matters, but in order to do so, we must seek to limit our emotional involvement, as hard as this may be. And as I'll say in a moment, the actual proceedings begun this morning with a hard-hitting video which showed the impact of those who lost lives. We can't discount that, and we obviously need to look at the lessons that could be learned in order to prevent serious harm in the future, including the possible treatments and early interventions that were quite clearly suppressed over the course of the pandemic. Will that get adequate covering? You know, Pierre Corey and his recent book, The War on Ivermectin, will testify that it's highly unlikely that these things will be taken seriously. Now, why is this inquiry so important? Well, we need answers. We need answers. Will we get them? I'm sure you're as skeptical as I am. But this inquiry has no deadline to hit. It's expected to last until at least 2026. Approximately £85 million has already been spent, and it's expected to cost several hundred million over the next 3 years. The inquiry may call up to or more than 1,000 witnesses to give evidence in that time. including at least 3 prime ministers. That's right, the merry-go-round yo-yo that we've got here in the UK. Numerous cabinet ministers, if they actually turn up or show willing to release evidence. More on that in a moment. And senior civil servants. Over the course of today's hearing, it was mad to see the actual crazy diagrams which showed the complex web of departments and individuals responsible for certain activities during the course of the pandemic. One of our previous guests talked about that complex web and its complete inefficiency. But that was clear to see today during the course of the proceedings. But I'll touch more on that as we go through. Now, the inquiry is being, if you've seen any of my previous episodes on this, split into 6 modules, but only the first 4 have been opened. Those are resilience and preparedness, decision-making by the government, sure to be the hot potato of the entire event, the impact of COVID on the healthcare system, and of course, the vaccines, the other big issue. And again, many questions will be asked. What kind of questions will be asked around the vaccines and the vaccine rollout? Now, the good news is we shouldn't have to wait 3 years for answers from the inquiry. The inquiry team has said that they will be producing interim reports as they go along, and the first report due within the next year, which for an inquiry of this magnitude could be deemed to be quite quick. You could argue, based upon what's happened over the last 3 years, that now the dust has settled to some degree, this is a rather lengthy process to get to what will almost inevitably be very clear lessons, at least for those of us who have a critical mind. But for this report, I'm sure it will just come back with conclusions that we can almost expect, that things should have been happened earlier and harder. But we will see. I have to remain an optimist. It's been made clear to me that it's important that I retain that optimistic spirit by my audience and dear friends alike who've been following my work, and not to be blighted by the doom that can come with these subjects. But I also have to have a dose of realism. Now, the clock, according to the sources within the COVID inquiry, not my words, is that the clock is already ticking to the next pandemic, which will obviously someone knows something that we don't, and knowing what we did wrong should help shape what we can do next time. Now, those who are paying close attention will see that we've not really had more than 3 outbreaks of pandemic proportion in the last 100 years. If you go back just slightly more than 100 years, you'll take that number up to 4 to include the Spanish flu. But we've not really had a strong series of major outbreaks of concern for a long period of time. So where this idea that we're going to require all these millions and billions of funds to prepare for the future in the UK and the Global Health Treaty through the WHO, what's really fueling that hysteria that is set in over the course of the last couple of years? We must be examining that. And we also have to be examining those who stand to gain from a future pandemic, of course. Now, the COVID inquiry has already been accused of wasting time. Let's not forget it was delayed last year already. But it's now been accused of wasting time and resources by inviting input from shoddy witnesses. In fact, 2/3 of the pro-lockdown far-left lobby group Independent Sage, led by communist Suzanne Michie, have been invited to give evidence despite playing no official role during the pandemic. They were purely a commentator on the sidelines, like many other organizations who are taking a more critical view. Yet the inquiry has invited 17 members from this inquiry to give evidence who are staunch advocates for lockdowns and harder measures. And one of the members of that particular group said that we should social distance for the rest of time. What a bright view of the future that person holds. Yet they've been called to give evidence. And what's that going to look like? Only time will tell. Now, in contrast, 2 academics who criticized government models and showcased how some of those points of evidence were wrong. Professor Carol Sikora, Dr. Tom Jefferson have been snubbed by the inquiry alongside many other doctors and scientists. We are working hard behind the scenes to see what we can do about that, because if critical thinking is permitted or dismissed from this inquiry, then, well, it's a foregone conclusion. If the implementation of lateral flows and masks to enter the inquiry wasn't a conclusion enough. However, there is some good news that Professor Carl Hennigan and Professor Sunetra Gupta, who were long-standing critics, in fact, Hennigan has been very vocal, both of these from the University of Oxford, and Sunetra Gupta in the Great Barrington Declaration. These have been included in the inquiry, but only on the basis that they formally gave advice and evidence to the government ministers. But that is at least some good news that there was some guaranteed critical voices within the inquiry. Now, former Tory leader Sir Ian Duncan Smith hit the nail on the head today by saying the point of this COVID inquiry is that we should be asking the kind of questions: did we need to lock down? This is to quote Sir Ian Duncan Smith. At the moment, what I can make out is they're not doing that. What they're actually doing is getting involved in the why didn't we lock down earlier debate. And I worry that they'll ignore the whole question of did we need to lock down in the way that we did? And that's the big question. And of course, that's the big question on many of our lips. And much of the research that's emerged both during this period of time and after suggests that it was absolutely the wrong measure. Last February, a trio of researchers recently published a working paper that led to some published work on COVID lockdowns and mortality, and it looked for evidence that lockdowns saved lives. And the findings were clear. The authors concluded that lockdowns prevented only 0.2% of European deaths during the first wave, which of course was the first major wave. Now, subject to an enormous amount of criticism from around the world, they then revised that number upwards towards 3%. However, there are many other papers that show the same, that lockdowns only had a negative impact and caused widespread and long-standing collateral harm that we're still experiencing today, a portion of which may be attributed towards the excess mortality and, of course, other outside factors relating to the pandemic response, which we've gone into many times on this podcast before. But of course, it's unlikely that any such evidence will actually make it into the inquiry. Now, I did mention this morning that the hearing began this morning with a video which showed the relatives of those who lost loved ones during the course of this pandemic talking about this experience, their experiences. The COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group has complained that not enough attention is being paid to those who lost their lives. And I think that's a fair point. I think it's a particularly fair point when we look at the absence of treatments and the suppression of treatments during that time, and the miscategorization of deaths that could lead to people bereaving things that perhaps have a different causal element, and that leaves mysteries to many people. But either way, of course, it's a very difficult time for those who lost loved ones, both directly related to the pandemic and indirectly related, as I've already mentioned. So the video set the scene, and again, of course, that points the inquiry in a particular direction, looking at the mortality of COVID, but questions on how was that categorized, how was it diagnosed, how was it clinically evaluated, are the numbers, are the statistics, is the data anyway a reflection of the actual problem? And as I've stated again over the last couple of years, it's going to be like making sense of finding a needle in a haystack because of the way that the data was collected in the first instance. Either way, I'm sure it won't actually be covered over the course of the pandemic, but surely questions have to be asked about the statistics and the data and the way that models were used. And maybe they will. Maybe they will. Maybe I need to bring a sense of the optimism I touched upon a minute ago. Now, Hugo Keith, who is the counsel for the inquiry, made his opening statement. And again, I'm going to quote because it's word for word his words. Now, he said, extraordinary though it may seem, given that it's the word lockdown has been forever seared into the nation's consciousness, there was very little debate pre-pandemic of whether a lockdown might prove to be necessary in the event of a runaway virus, let alone how a lockdown could be avoided. Very little thought was given to how, if proved to be necessary, how something as complex, difficult, and damaging as a national lockdown could be put in place at all. Equally, there appears to have been a failure to think through the potentially massive impact on education and on the economy in trying to control a runaway virus in this way. He also said that we'll likely never know how the virus that caused COVID-19 was first transmitted to the human race. Well, we know that you will never find what you don't look for, that's for sure. And it seems that the questions around the possible construction, the possible man-made nature of this problem is not receiving the type of scrutiny that it deserves, given the widespread implications of that potential reality. And look out for an interview on the podcast very soon, recorded at the Better Way podcast event with Dr. David Anderson, where he shares some very damning evidence about the gain of function research taking place in Wuhan and how it was funded and how it may have led to the possible release, intentional or otherwise, of this particular virus. Now, of course, Hugo Keith lands on a really important point. Well, firstly, the reason why we've never assessed lockdowns is they've long been excluded from a pandemic response, given the widespread harms and collateral damage they would occur. So it's important that we address those questions, and I'm glad it's been raised early on in the inquiry, because the preparedness aspect has shown that lockdowns have long been ruled out, and we broke the pandemic rulebook to actually deploy them, and we must ask why. And again, we must ask the origins of such policies and why they were enacted at such a global scale. Now, there's some other challenges when it comes to actually finding the truth on this on our own shores here. The Cabinet Office have refused to hand over some key requested documents to the inquiry, including, of course, Boris Johnson's text messages, although we've already seen a lot of Matt Hancock's, and it just reconfirmed what we already know, that there is a large-scale incompetence at play here, as well as some potential damning intent. Now, Stephen Ford, again, I'm going to quote here, who's representing the Association of Directors of Public Health. All of the departments have got crazily long titles. You can't blame me for that one. He used his opening statement to complain about the way that central government sidelined local health authorities. He said that, firstly, at the start of the pandemic, the Department for Health and Social Care, that's another long title, the DHSC, did not hold an up-to-date contact list for directors of the public health in the various local authorities. Again, that's been validated by some of our previous guests, who said it's totally disorganized. No one knew who was supposed to be responsible for what, despite the pre-pandemic planning exercises. And secondly, at the start of the pandemic, directors were learning, this is local directors, were learning about new policies and guidance at the same time as members of the public when they were televised in those wonderful 5 p.m. daily briefings. They were, that caveat, I definitely ad-libbed on that direct statement quote, so it's no longer a direct quote. They're expected to impose, and this is back to his quote, they're expected to impose these policies without the necessary structures and support mechanisms having been in place. Now, the other point I'd add to that is the necessary scrutiny. So essentially, the politicians would get on stage at 5 p.m. with the scientist to deliver the science and impose these policies without any clear instruction and without any clear guidance around how they're deployed to the local areas, but critical point, without any real scrutiny. And the idea that the science was being followed throughout is something that should be heavily questioned. Now, who else is going to be giving evidence? Well, so far there's no clear published list of those who will be giving evidence, although senior government ministers are widely expected to give evidence. And perhaps now that Boris is well and truly out of the scene, he may take the opportunity to throw some people under the bus. It could get messy, that's for sure. But will we actually move anywhere closer to any semblance of a real lesson learned about what went wrong? I don't think we'll find it during the course of this particular inquiry. Now, I'm sure there will be some damning evidence that is revealed, which will certainly unpack some of the conflicts of interest, the corruption, the mismanagement, the incompetence. But will it get to the core questions that need to be asked? I'm very skeptical. Now, the big question then becomes, how on earth do we actually find a sense of justice? How do we find a sense of accountability? Do we need some form of independent global inquiry, given the roles of the WHO, the other international bodies, other unelected NGOs, the WEF, of course, and various different intergovernmental organizations that played a critical role in this, including those who, within the big pharma world, Gavi, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and various other institutions that clearly influenced the course of this pandemic. I'm highly skeptical that the local inquiries will even get into those details of the role that have been played of those international organizations. So the question becomes, how will we ultimately learn the lessons from this, and how will we move forward? And that question has a very long and complicated answer, in my view, and a very long set of long-term solutions to solve the problem. But the reality is, if we fail to learn the lessons, then the next time anything that could be deemed a possible emergency arises on our shores, we can surely expect to see more of the same baked into policy through national governments and the international treaties that are emerging. So this is a critical inquiry. I'm deeply skeptical of it, but nonetheless, we must play our part in finding a way to influence its outcomes by making sure that there is a balanced set of individuals giving evidence. And I think we've all got a role to play in that. There is an open process for the public to make their own statements for evidence that will be included. We'll put the links in the comments for that one. And it's important that we have our voices heard. It's important that we put our points across. But how confident are you? Yeah, how confident are you that the corruption, the conflicts of interests, the malintent, the way that this whole debacle has been managed globally in lockstep is ever going to get the kind of accountability and scrutiny it needs? I'm very, very much skeptical of that. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The Pandemic Podcast is back for now. It's important that we continue to track these types of goings on, as well as the latest evidence as it unfolds. But I'm also working on a much bigger project, looking at how we can actually tackle these bigger questions and actually find solutions on a global scale to these major issues, working locally, regionally, and nationally, and across the world. So if you're interested in finding out more about what we've got planned, I've got a workshop on Monday night next week that we'll be delivering to give some insights into what I've been working on. And I'd love to get your feedback and ideas about how we can move forward. So if you're not already on our mailing list, if you're not already on the mailing list, please click the link in the description of this post. It's weareelevate.org/pandemic. Sorry, it's danastingregory.com/pandemic. And you'll be able to get access to the mailing list. I'm going to put it into the chat as well, and you can join the mailing list for the latest updates. So watch this space. I'll be posting details on social media of our Monday workshop. It is time to start thinking about how we move forward. It's long overdue, in fact, and there's some really interesting solutions coming to the surface that I'll be sharing on Monday. So watch out for that. In the meantime, I'll see you very, very soon. This is the Pandemic Podcast with me, Dan Astin-Gregory, and despite reaching tens of millions of people over the last couple of years with our content, the reality is now it's incredibly hard to get through the censorship to tackle these particular issues. We are going to be transitioning to the platforms like Odyssey, Rumble for our primary content, because it's an uphill battle. We wanted to stay on these platforms so that we can reach a wider audience, and perhaps those who've yet to ask questions. Typically people on Rumble and Odyssey are the people who are already asking questions, already critical of these narratives. So we want to help expand that conversation, and the mainstream platforms are really the way to do that. But we will see. We'll continue to put what we can on these platforms until we get completely taken down once again. But in the meantime, we'll also be able to put our full content on our private platforms and Rumble and Odyssey. So watch this space. Thanks again for tuning in. Please share this if you can, and tag people who you think should be watching this show. Thanks very much. I'll see you again.